Welcome. We're going to talk to you about a systematic review of the role of virtual reality in developing social skills for students with ASD. I'm Maggie Mosier, a doctoral student at the University of Kansas Department of Special Education and a content strategist for VOICE, a virtual reality program to teach social skills to middle school students with autism and learning disabilities.
I'm Adam Carrion. I'm a doctoral candidate at KU in the Department of Special Education, and I'm also the tech specialist on the VOICE application Maggie was just talking about.
So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about the review of previous literature reviews and what they told us about virtual reality. We're also going to talk about the findings from this review, some implications for teachers and researchers, and then have you ask your questions. This review does we looked at virtual reality, mixed reality, and augmented reality, and extended reality, but you'll see as we go what actually came about from what we found.
So the problem we found was that we know that social skill deficits cause a variety of problems for students with ASD and students in general. So they can negatively, in fact, influence the academic performance of the student, interfere with relationships. It will increase aggression for students. It'll also increase the risk of having difficulties in emotional well-being. If these problems and challenges are not addressed and they continue into adulthood, they are likely linked to both underemployment and unemployment. Further, IDEA requires that we prepare students for independent living and employment. So without addressing these social skills issues, we likely are not touching that IDEA strand.
The Every Student Succeeds Act also talked to us about the importance of teaching social skills to all students at all grade levels and mandated that states start to do so as well as with the academics. So what we did in this review is looked at the social validity of immersive reality to teach social skills to students with autism spectrum disorder. We looked at the critical research, and really social validity, why it's so important is it tells us whether an intervention is appropriate, desired, maintained, and generalized. So if we don't have this information, we can blindly apply an intervention that may not be effective and may be virtually a waste of our time. Really, technology that is used to teach social skills isn't new. We've had video modeling and social narratives presented through technology for quite some time. The difference being it has been only in the last 10 years that augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality have really been used specifically for students with autism spectrum disorder to teach social skills. The social validity framework looks at 3 specific parts of an intervention: the goals, whether they're important and justified, the procedures, whether they're appropriate and acceptable, and the outcomes, whether it's meaningful and important. Social validity really varies depending on what's going on in an intervention, but what we're looking at is both the students, whether they feel that the intervention is socially valid, also the parents, teachers, and everyone that interacts with the students.
We thought we would define these acronyms that we keep using over and over again as a way to make you understand what we're doing more. So to give you an idea, just the virtual reality that we're talking about, this could be any 3-dimensional simulation. It does not have to be the headsets that you're seeing occur more often. So when we look at virtual reality, we're looking at 2 different defining characteristics. The immersion, how well do you feel like you're in that environment? And the interaction, how well can you interact or manipulate or visualize what is going on? The other ones, augmented reality, takes an opposite look at virtual reality. This one is using the physical space that we think about, like looking out in front of your computer or even on your computer, and then adding digital elements to it. Mixed reality kind of combines the technologies and makes VR and AR into one cohesive, let's say, intervention. So you have the ability to use both. And then extended reality is basically taking mixed reality and using data and immersing yourself further into that. So you can read these here, and then it's, as we didn't find much with that, it's not as important to this.
Yeah, when we were looking at studies, we actually only found studies specific to our criteria for virtual reality and augmented reality. So what we did to determine social validity when we were reviewing things is we used Ryko and colleagues' quality social validity indicators of evidence-based practices for students with autism spectrum disorder. These categories included the social relevance of the technology, the relevance of the intervention, whether it was accessible, easy to use, how satisfied everyone was with the results, the behavioral change, whether it was large enough for practical value, whether the success continued after the intervention ceased, whether those skills were actually generalized into a natural environment, and whether they were maintained over time. On top of those 9 categories, we also had additional indicators that teachers stated, and also any interventionist were included in this, stated also influenced their desire to use technology. So these are specific to the technology piece. And that was the number of sessions that students were required to use, how long those sessions were, the time span of those sessions, the application outside of the technology, and then also whether these studies had norm referenced pre and post comparisons, multiple measures of performance, and whether there was a fidelity and reliability check. Because we do know with a lot of things, technology, teachers are told to do them because they're new and exciting and motivating, but they don't necessarily know if they're going to work. So we needed to add those components to provide that social validity of, yes, if you follow these steps, this is going to be effective.
In looking at the previous literature for virtual reality, we found 7 reviews of the research. We're going to kind of just summarize that here, but they do have a lot more information in them if you would like to check that out. Bolani and colleagues found that VR works in moderate to high virtual immersion. So basically your more headsets, your cave environments, and that the tolerance of VR equipment, however, only included 2 studies with students with ASD. So more would be necessary to see if students would wear a headset and find that something that they would like. Radu found AR in educational settings improved content recall, memory retention, collaboration, and motivation. However, the high achieving students did not display the same results. Micropolis and Natsis examined VR's use in specific content areas, specifically math or other content areas. VR was useful in improving higher order thinking skills. And then Merchant and colleagues found that game-based learning environments were the most effective, but they did find no statistical significance between the 3 forms of desktop VR that they had investigated in student learning.
Howard and Gutworth also looked at VR training and found it more effective than comparison programs by almost 3/4 of a standard deviation. Those comparison programs included things that we typically use to teach social skills, which include video modeling, direct instruction by the teacher, and peer mentoring. Vasquez and colleagues reviewed 19 unique studies that targeted social skill development using virtual environments for K-12 students with ASD. And they found that the simulations may be a more effective method for student engagement and social skill improvement, but they weren't able to find studies with consistent validity and reliability data over time. Adam and I also did a study that reviewed 25 different studies of students with disabilities in K-12 settings that examined the defining characteristics of immersion levels associated with VR. Those results were actually helped us to determine to do this study because the results and tables for this study sparked interest in narrowing the scope of the social validity of virtual reality. So we decided to look at 2 questions that no one had really examined to this point. How frequently was social validity measured and reported in studies that were using AR, VR, and MR for social skill acquisition? And then what are those reported social validity measures? What were the goals, the procedures, the outcomes, the importance of the studies using AR, VR, and MR to teach social skills to students with ASD?
In order to answer those questions, we took to the internet databases. We used ERIC, PsycInfo, ScienceDirect, and Web of Science. We also narrowed our focus to recent technology, so 2000 to 2020, a 20-year period of English peer-reviewed articles. While we likely missed some early versions of VR, what we wanted to focus on was the newer versions that would help what's helping students learn nowadays. Furthering that, we used a hand search of autism research, the Journal of Special Ed Technology, Computers in Education, Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, autism research, and focus on autism and other developmental disabilities. We wanted to have a complete view, so we thought these would be the most useful journals to comb through to make sure we weren't missing anything. And for the validity, we made sure that we had the second author, me, independently replicate the search. Following the search, we were able to narrow it down by using inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. So for our inclusion, we used VR, AR, or MR. We did have XR, but we never found any of those. So we haven't included that here. We had a minimum of 1 school-age student with the diagnosis of ASD, and they had to be empirically based using single subject, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, basically rigorous research. And then we excluded articles that did not use a research design or target a social skill intervention using the technology for school-age children. We also excluded things that examined elements of virtual reality, but did not focus on the application of the technology, or in other words, using technology to teach students. Finally, we excluded ones that were not subject to peer review. So this is just kind of our search process. So we found 2,774 articles initially. I replicated the study, or the findings to the exact same number. Then we removed 1,800 duplicates that left us 950 articles. Following the hand search, we had one additional article, leaving us with 951. And then looking at the the reviews that we found, we ended up with 4 additional for 955. Then after we applied the inclusion criteria, 71 articles were made into it. Then after exclusion criteria, we ended with 40. And Maggie did an ancestral review of the 40 articles that we included and found one more, leaving us with a total of 41.
We decided to code for over 134 categories. We looked at whether a single social skill was taught through the technology, multiple social skills, or a social skill and something else, such as an academic skill. We used specific definitions for what skill was being taught. Relationship skills included both verbal and nonverbal communication, social engagement, and relationship building. Executive functioning focused on a task, creating a plan of action, completing multiple tasks at a single time. And social awareness focused on understanding the causes of events or behaviors, perspective taking, and respecting another's perspectives. Anything that we were unsure about was coded as unclear when it didn't have sufficient evidence for us to all make an agreement, or sufficient evidence was not in the study. We also coded for whether the technology used direct instruction or observational learning to teach the social skill. Direct instruction was considered when there was explicit teaching of a social skill in a purposeful and meaningful manner. Observational learning was when the behavior was supposed to be taught by watching others' behaviors and the implications of that behavior, but there was no direct teaching. We also coded for the technology immersion and whether any outside of assistance was present, such as prompting.
In order to ensure that our results were reliable through coding, we used the iterator reliability from Cochrane Review. We used 52 items that resulted in 2,184 total included articles. When we went to do the iterator reliability, we found that we were at 96.7%. To get to 100%, we used an independent coder, which was another person that we trained on coding that were not involved in the original coding. So through them, we were able to reach 100% on our data.
The limitations of this study was that we only looked at students with ASD where the technology was applied and school-age students. We used only peer-reviewed articles. We only searched from those 4 databases for that specific date range. We also had specific definitions for observational learning and direct instruction, which may differ depending on the researcher involved. The studies also took place in 11 countries with primarily male students and IQs above 70. There were smaller sample sizes, which may not represent enough diversity to really generalize some findings. And the effect sizes were not calculated, which would have allowed some comparison across groups.
So what did we find? After coding, we found that the studies that we included, the 41, we had 524 males with ASD and 87 females for ASD. These ranged from ages 2 to 20 years old. Of the 41 articles, 6 of them were focused on AR. 27 of them were focused on non-immersive VR. So that would be like your desktop looking at a screen type VR. 10 of them used immersive VR. So that would be your headsets or your caves or something where you're inside of an environment. Of those, 34 studies stated treatment agent and settings. 19 occurred in schools, 10 in a clinic, and 5 in multiple different environments. The treatment agent in these studies, 21 studies had researchers as the treatment person, 16 of them had teachers, 9 of them had clinicians, and only 3 of them used the parents. Some of the study characteristics that we found was that these ranged from 1 session for 1 day all the way up to 80 sessions for 4 months. But the average we found was only 14 sessions. The session times varied too, from 10 minutes all the way up to 150 minutes. 150 minutes was used for laptops and joysticks, as like the head mounted displays, the headsets and stuff would be too long for a student to withstand that. 30 of the studies were used to improve social skills, multiple social skills, 7 a single social skill, and 4 studies did not clearly state any targeted skill. The social skills we found in these articles that were taught included emotion recognition, cooperation, relationship skills, social awareness, and executive functioning.
We looked at the ease of use, and 11 studies said that the technology was easy to use. 2 studies said that the technology initially was difficult but became comfortable with time, and those 2 studies were both fully immersive virtual reality. 4 studies reported mixed results on the ease of use. The participants whose IQ scores were higher than 70 reported that the technology was accessible, while those with IQs lower than 70 reported the technology was difficult to use. And that again was primarily used with immersive virtual reality. We looked at the attitudes and views. 18 of the 41 studies actually included the attitudes and views toward the technology. 13 of those studies said that it was positive. 2 studies said that it was negative, and 3 studies had mixed results, where some students really thought the technology was great and some students didn't like the technology at all. 15 studies stated whether participants liked the intervention within the technology. Of those, 14 studies said that the intervention was actually exciting and rewarding, and 1 study reported that they had mixed feelings toward that intervention. Specifically, the mixed feeling study felt that some students felt the intervention was boring, the technology was fun, and some students felt like the intervention was fun and the technology was fun. We looked at the way the intervention was presented and whether that was useful, having it presented through the specific technology. 35 studies stated whether intervention was presented through the technology was useful. Of those, 34 said it was, and 1 had mixed results. The one with mixed results was non-immersive virtual reality, and the study specifically said that it was useful for some students, but not useful for other students, and certain people in generalization stage felt that it was generalized and certain people felt it wasn't. 5, or 15%, in which the participants and agents reported the intervention useful, but there was no significant improvement on the specific target skill. For example, the teacher said that the intervention was helpful for the students, but the target skill was emotion recognition, and that didn't change. But sharing or other skills that were taught may have changed or improved, and so the teacher felt it was helpful. Same with parents in those studies. The intervention significance in the 41 studies, only 35 studies stated that, but the 35 said that it was effective for teaching the targeted skill. 6 studies stated whether the participant was able to use the technology to actually complete the social task. 26 studies said it was effective, 4 studies said it was ineffective, and 11 studies had mixed results, where 1 skill was helpful, but it may not have been the targeted skill, or the targeted skill was improved, but it didn't reach statistical significance. And that could be for a number of reasons, some of which were small sample sizes. 35 studies reported participants' increase in knowledge, skills, or experience from the technology intervention. 32 of those studies said that there was a significant increase. 3 studies said that there was no increase. Finally, we looked at generalization and maintenance. Generalization, only 20 studies reported on generalizing. 19 of those reported the environment and the person. 15 studies said it was generalized. 4 studies said some people generalized the skills, some didn't, and 1 study showed no generalization at all. Maintenance, 13 studies reported maintenance. 10 studies said that it was maintained. 2, maintenance happened for a few students, but not all students, and 1 study had no maintenance whatsoever. This is an example graph of the social validity per technology type. So it goes through the augmented reality, non-immersive virtual reality, and immersive virtual reality, and what the feelings, ease of use, usefulness, and generalization and maintenance were for each type of technology. The percentage is the percentage of the number of studies that were included that worked with students with ASD. So the positive feelings about tech and the intervention tended to be higher for the non-immersive, but that could be because the non-immersive was able to be used in multiple settings, and the virtual reality tended to have more positive feelings toward it than augmented reality for a number of different reasons, some of which said having the augmented reality, they just couldn't use it as frequently, and they had to have things to put it up against. The technology accessibility was easiest for non-immersive. The ease of use was actually easiest for augmented reality, and then non-immersive, and then virtual reality. The usefulness Everyone found the augmented reality useful, and non-immersive and immersive were about the same. What's interesting is the immersive technology actually showed an increase in knowledge and skill more than the other two. The success after the training, it was easier to continue being successful with augmented reality. And again, that could be because it's more available in some locations, it's mobile, and immersive reality was not successful after the training. That could be because the students didn't actually have the immersive technology to continue. Generalization and maintenance, again, augmented reality showed a much higher, and immersive tended to be the lowest, but it also could be for the same reason. One of the things that was really interesting in the studies was determining that immersive technology, even though it's harder and people find it less accessible at the beginning, overall, in the end, it tended to have better skills or increase in skills on the scores at the end, the longer it was used.
Okay, like we said, we were going to include some graphs. So this is just kind of an example of a table that we used, and we'll have that attached, and we can talk about that more during the session. All right, and now we're going to get to the discussion, or what we like to say, the useful stuff that might actually mean something to you. So the first thing we know, and it seems kind of obvious, is that the higher number that we found of social validity indicators means that it's probably going to be more effective. So this typically meant over 9 social validity indicators. Also, the usefulness was always reported on the technology, but not the intervention, which we may find to be interesting and useful. One study that reported higher social validity had the teachers make the intervention. They created the environment. Also, the correlation in use of technology was correlated with the attitude towards the technology. So this would be like the teacher understanding the technology and liking the technology would lead her to use it more. The use also affected the participants' attitudes, and then the technology aligned to the student's specific social skill needs in only 15 of the 41. So that means that a majority of the studies were just throwing social skills for use and learning instead of trying to figure out what social skill deficit and intervention appropriately matched the student. Additionally, higher levels of immersion seem to be more conducive for learning. The closer the VR matched to the real world, students were distracted when anything did not match the environment. So that was where the teachers designed the environment, and then the students actually noticed things that were not in place, and it seemed to be distracting to them. 41% of the studies, students with ASD were not given any direct instruction. So 93% of these were using observational learning as the modes for teaching, which we know that we need both to be successful. So this included modeling a prior instruction with peers, and explicit observation need to be there when you're teaching through observational learning, not just looking at a program. Finally, cultural validity was not included, despite the studies that we found spanned 11 different countries.
So what does this mean for the future? Well, we know that we should be considering not just the intervention, but also the technology, and vice versa. Not just the technology, but also the intervention we put within the technology. We also need to consider whether the student's skills fits the intervention that we put in the technology. So we need to match the students with the correct intervention and with the correct technology. We also realized that mixed reality isn't currently being used to teach social skills to students with autism, but it could actually help with the generalization. As you saw in our first chart, the generalization and maintenance for immersive virtual reality was low, but it could be improved if you included augmented reality, such as allowing them devices where they could take what they learned in the virtual reality setting, bring it into the classroom, and when you put the device up against a wall or something, it would give them tips to remind them what they just learned in the virtual reality. Because the skills greatly improved in the virtual reality, but they need to be maintained and generalized to be effective. What this means for teachers is that we have to also consider whether the technology is accessible and available. Some of the high immersive technology wasn't as accessible and available as it could be. Observational learning and direct instruction are effective for specific skills. For example, observational learning, a student can learn certain emotion recognition from observing those emotions and the reactions. However, the student wasn't able to learn things like executive functioning skills by just observing. They needed that direct instruction. The sensory needs and the thresholds for the participants should be considered. For example, teachers may want to look at virtual reality that allows you to turn off certain functioning. One study had the ability to fly and voice chat. So the student with autism was constantly using that ability to fly and not paying attention to any instruction, or constantly clicking the voice chat button, and that caused them to miss the instruction. So things that we might not consider but are extremely distracting, having the option to take those out of the actual environment. The attitudes towards the technology correlated with the degree of use, and that's important for us to help make that technology easy for students and teachers to present to students. That way they continue to use it. One final interesting thing was that the physical rewards weren't needed anymore. The technology ended up being rewarding enough, and rewards weren't needed in the technology. Just playing the game ended up being rewarding for students, so they didn't need badges and trophies like we kind of assumed they would to continue to play. So recommendations are helping them get comfortable with the technology before you put them in an intervention. Determining that targeted skill before you provide the intervention. Observational learning was effective when teaching relationship skills and cooperation, but not all emotion recognition, some, and it definitely didn't help with executive functioning and social awareness at all. Sensory needs and the thresholds for the participants, some students did struggle with, specifically students with an IQ of lower than 70 and autism spectrum disorder struggled with the virtual reality actually wearing the pieces. The attitudes towards the technology correlated with that degree of use, which we just said, and the physical rewards not being needed. We also need to look more at that cost-benefit analysis. It is extremely easy to get a lot of virtual reality on non-immersive and augmented reality. There are a lot of free of both of those available to teachers right now. However, there aren't a lot of headsets available to teachers. So figuring out how we can help make that cost-benefit better. And then human development factors. Before the age of 6, there are very few regulations as to what is effective and non-effective for full immersion in brain development, and just understanding what are those developmental factors and how do they influence these interventions as we use them.
We want to thank you for listening to us today talk about our virtual reality project. If you want links to the references, we'll have those available, and we'll have the charts like we talked about available, and any other information you can ask us following the watching of this video. So thank you.
Have a good one.